All right, I think I'm going to start. Should we close the door, or that's okay? I mean, I don't hear any noise, so they'll join. All right. So yeah, as I was saying, it's my first business trip in 2 years. I've been doing a lot of presentations during this 2 years, and I was trying to count last night. I think I have probably delivered about 50 Zoom WebEx presentations in these 2 years, but it's been 2 years without doing it live in person or in an office. So just happy to be here. Really happy that you're here to watch this. And I prepared something that I think is going to be interesting. If you were here, I don't recognize some of you, but if you were here on the session before this one, 11 at 11, they talk about the risks on open source and some, how if you go for projects on the foundations, there's to lower the risks because there's a governance and there's more. And this is a nice segue because I want to talk about risks, but I'm going to talk about this from the support perspective and what do we mean with open source support, long-term support, end of life. I'll give you some examples of that. So hopefully you'll learn something from this, and for the next half an hour you'll hear more about or you'll learn something about this, right? I even gonna use my little clicker here. So it works. Yes. My background, it's always in software, sales engineer, solution architect, and product management. For the last couple of years, more dedicated to advocacy, open source advocate, chief evangelist with Perforce. Represent a brand that we call Open Logic. That what we do is we provide technical support, enterprise technical support for open source packages, open source software. And happy to talk more about that later. We have only a virtual tour, a virtual booth here. So you can see all my contact details. Happy to engage in more conversations with you. So we've been talking about open source for the last couple of days, and I haven't seen a slide like this to promote more of what we're doing in open source. See how many packages do we have out there? Like if you work with Node.js, JavaScript, more than 1.7 million packages on NPM, right? And I'm not going to talk about risks right now, but it's just how many packages are out there, right? And the same if you are programming in Java or PHP or Python. Look at the numbers, and I'm more impressed with the numbers below, which is how many packages per day, new packages per day. It's amazing. I mean, obviously this is global, right? People from all over the world contributing and or just making the libraries available for everyone. Actually, I have the source. Actually, it's lost at the bottom of the screen, but the source for this, you can go and check. It's mobilecount.com, and I check this slide from time to time, and obviously keeps growing, keeps growing. And in terms of the Linux foundations, obviously, as you know, when an open source project makes it, start getting traction, more users, more contributors, and a good path is to be part of one of these foundations, because then you get more governance, you can get more budget, you get more contributors, more visibility. So these numbers, more than 600 and all the Linux Foundation umbrella, right? That includes the Continuous Delivery Foundation and Cloud Native Foundation and Open Mainframe Foundation and so many others. More than 600 projects, Apache, more than 270 projects. Like these are the good ones, right? Or sorry, have to step back. Not the good ones, the popular ones. Right? These are the popular ones. These are the ones that, for the most part, if you decide to use any of the open source projects for your initiatives, you are going to be okay, because there's going to be a commitment by the community to have a support, long-term support on those projects. And that's what I'm going to be talking about for the next few minutes. So there are more guarantees, there's less risk. As I was saying on the previous session, they talk about the risks. And there's, if you are working for an important organization, or you're basically building a very important app, a mission critical app, well, you have to be careful with what you use, right? Most you're going to be using open source, right? In some cases, maybe 90% of your applications are going to be based on open source libraries, open source packages. Well, you lower your risk if you go out with some of these popular open source projects, right? Without endorsing anyone here, But the key piece is that they have a long-term support. There's a time where you know that the major releases are going to be supported. So don't have to tell you what this, right? You know, everyone knows here what an open source project is. There's some commonalities, same things, right? Obviously the code is open there. There's a documentation that you have to have on your open source project. But what about the release life cycle, right? That's not going to be the same. And it applies for open source and it applies for closed source, right? Commercial software. The release cycles are going to be very, very different. So I have a few examples for you. There's actually some gray arrows that didn't make the screen there. So there are arrows there that pointing to the right. And just didn't know that, just notice this. So there are arrows where you see the numbers, there are arrows. 4 examples. And I specifically looked for these examples because they are different, right? Obviously very successful open source projects. The Linux kernel, right? Since 1991. By the way, we're in 2021, so it's been 30 years. Back in just a few weeks ago, August was basically the 30-year anniversary where Linus Torvalds sent that email saying, look what I'm doing here, right? So it's been 30 years, and they're in version 5, right? More or less every 5-6 years, there's a new major release, and I'll tell you a little bit more details. Node.js, much more recent, 2009. Some of you might remember in 2014 that fork. The community wasn't happy. Joyent, this company in San Diego, was basically the stewardship. They're basically managing the project. They didn't want to go that fast, right? Because they were using Node.js for their enterprise applications. And there were some other disputes there, and they decided to fork, right? Not a good thing. I was actually working for a company that all our development was on Node.js, and we were like, oh, what are we going to do now? Right? Do we go with the fork? Do we stay? What do we do that? Thankfully, you know, they talked to each other. They basically got into the OpenJS Foundation and then kind of merged again less than a year later, right? And now they moved so much faster, and we're now on version 6, major version 16. Spark, much more recently, obviously very, very successful. Apache Spark has become really, really successful, especially for all those AI machine learning initiatives. They're only on, you know, compared with Node.js, they're only on version 3 right now, major version 3 right now. And then Kubernetes, 2015, right? Hard to believe, it's only 6 years. It's only 6 years old, Kubernetes, right? Hard to believe. And they're not even moving to major version 2, right? So my point here is every open source project has their own life cycle. And by the way, they change their cycles as they become more successful, as they get more contributions, right? So let me give you a little bit more details into that. This graph, it's available on Wikipedia. They do a really good job on keeping track of the different releases. What you see in color are the releases, right? Major release 1, version 2, and then version 3, different colors. What you see in gray before the color, that's the development, time of development. And then in gray after the color is the time that they're going to continue to support that release. So the long-term support. And when I said long-term support, I mean they're going to keep updating those releases, right? Fixes, bug fixes, addressing vulnerability fixes. Couple of things just to highlight here. Between 6 and 10 years life cycle, right? If you see the dates, that's a nice thing about Linux. It's been supported for not only Linux kernel, but also the distributions. They've been supported for about 10 years, which is good for the enterprise. And that has been a key for the success of Linux, that enterprise adopt this because there's a long-term support, right? If they would have been just like a year, probably would still stay with Unix or Windows or who knows, right? But I want to talk about Node.js, which is also used in the enterprise, and the life cycle is much shorter, right? It's more or less around 2 major releases per year, right? Their long-term support is just about 2 years, about 30 months. And they only apply, or they only provide long-term support for the event releases, meaning just like version 12, version 14, version 16, those are the ones that are going to keep long-term support. If you're on an old version, you're not getting the long-term support, right? So you have to pay attention to those things. If you're developing, if your organization is using it, you have to pay attention to those versions. And again, every community, open source community, it's different. So very, very important to keep an eye on those things. Spark, very different. Spark, donated in 2013. They have about 3-4 releases per year, right? That's quarterly, right? That's very quick. They only apply long-term support, which is more standard, to the last minor version, right? So the last on the major version 1, the last one was 1.6. They apply long-term support 1.6. The last on the version 2 is 2.4, so they apply long-term support for 2.4. And now they are on 3.x, on 2.1. Now, talking about risks, Apache Spark is pretty much driven by Databricks. The inventor, I forgot now the name, the person that created the Matei Zaharia, that it started Spark from Berkeley University and then donated to Apache. He actually founded Databricks, right? So the company is pretty much driving this community or this open source project. There are many contributors, but as you well know, when there's one company that is driving the project, there's, they can make the decisions they want, right? Google does that a lot. And I have another example for you, CentOS, right? And I'll talk to you about CentOS for just a second, but is Databricks influence? Absolutely. There's no question about that, right? And then obviously Kubernetes. Kubernetes basically, I wouldn't consider long-term support. They're moving so fast, right? And again, Kubernetes has been deployed across all verticals in all industries. So what I said at the beginning that Linux, Linux has been successful because we have long-term supports of 10 years. That's why enterprises have been adopting Linux. Well, what about Kubernetes? Right? People are actually, or enterprises are adopting Kubernetes, and they're moving in 15 weeks, more or less 15-week release cycles. That's a lot, right? And they're basically, for example, on version 1.19, they provided 12-month support and then 2 more months of updates. So, that's not really long-term support, right? But you have to keep moving, right? Because why? You've seen the supply chain attacks, the updates. I actually, after watching, I think we had like 2 or 3 sessions so far on supply chain. So I decided to add another slide there at the end, just to add to the to the discussion. So I'll talk about that at the end. But my point here is, you have to be aware of all these things. You have to be aware of when is at the end of the long-term support is when we call it end of life, right? End of life meaning no more updates to that version, major, minor version. These are the challenges. Why the release life cycles are getting smaller and smaller? Because of this, right? And you see it with any other application development nowadays. I mean, obviously it's great to automate. It's great to keep moving fast, to not roll back, but to roll forward, right? To go fix it, next deploy, keep moving. So if you have to go back and support older versions, that's an issue, and that takes resources, and that takes a lot of time, right? I mean, that's just logical. So these are the issues, right? You also, as you had more contributors, you have to merge all that code. You have to review all those commits. On the keynote from Google, they were talking about, I don't know if you watched it with the questions, you have to have someone else reviewing those commits, right? Not just the same person and things like that. So, I mean, that's the reality. That's open source support for you today. Another factor, by the way, which people forget, is open source projects. You want a successful open source project, you want that project available in all platforms, and not all platforms are x86, right? You might want it also on an ARM processor, ARM32, ARM64, right? Or you might want it in some other platforms like S390X or others. If you don't know what S390X, that's the platform for IBM Z, the mainframes. And other platforms. So this is one example in this table that this open source project, you see if you can guess the open source project. They're supporting across all these Linux distributions and for these processor architectures. Any guess? I mean, it could be anything, right? But I mean, you see, there's a good number of supported, there's a good variety, right? Which means it's a large project with a lot of contributors. Yeah, probably a company really sponsoring that community. Any guess? .NET. This is .NET 5, open source. It's been open source now for a few years, .NET. Last version I was, I used to work for IBM. I used to work for Red Hat. I used to work for a few places. We used to work closely with Microsoft about .NET, and it's all open source. Yes, Microsoft is kind of driving that community, but there are a lot of contributors. And they have to go and support all these different Linux distributions and these different platforms. So it becomes more complex, right? So that explains why you need shorter life cycles, shorter long-term supports. And that's the trend, right? So smaller releases, obviously do your automated testing, obviously try to do your security testing, your scans, and yeah, and support less releases, like very important to backport patches, right? And if you have to support it for years, that takes a lot of effort. That takes definitely a lot of effort in going backporting patches and time consuming, right? So here are some noteworthy end-of-life software. And if you were not aware of this, well, now you know. No excuse, now you know, I'm telling you. But there's so many, right? You have to keep an eye. So look at these examples. Angular has been around for some time. Angular 1, which is called the AngularJS, it's finally end of life at the end of this year, and then December 31st, right? It's been around for 12 years. There was actually an extension of 6 months because of COVID. 12 years has been around, hard to believe. I remember when it started, right? Hard to believe. Well, if you have applications on AngularJS, Angular 1, version 1, you're not gonna have any more fixes, any more vulnerability fixes, patches, things like that, right? So keep an eye. Python version 2, it's also going end of life. Actually, already went end of life after 10 years. Oracle Java on March 2022, after 8 years. Drupal, WordPress, missing a couple of other content management solutions. They are known because they have a ton of vulnerabilities, a ton of PHP vulnerabilities, right? So important. November 2022, there are not going to be any more updates. That's end of life. No more updates to Drupal 7. All right. And then CentOS, interesting story, right? If you were not aware, I'll tell you a little bit about the CentOS story. End of life, it's also at the end of this year. CentOS 8, and that's the last CentOS. Why? Miss again my arrows for some reason. There's an arrow over there. CentOS, very popular Linux distribution, probably after Ubuntu, depending what source you use. Probably after Ubuntu is probably the second most successful or more popular open source, completely open source Linux distribution, right? I'm not counting the Red Hat Enterprise Linux or Ubuntu Enterprise or SUSE Enterprise, that they grew a lot. There are commercial versions, right? But open source that you download for free. Probably CentOS after Ubuntu, probably the second most popular. And we had the story where in 2014, Red Hat pretty much took ownership of that open source project, right? In fact, they hired some of the contributors, engineers, and there's a board. Has all the governance like any other open source project, but it's pretty much driven by Red Hat, right? That's a reality. And that, by the way, that's a reality on many of the popular open source projects today. That's why it's also good if they're coming from a foundation, because the foundations make sure that there's diversity, right? Or there are multiple companies part of those projects. So since 2014, it's been pretty much Red Hat resources. I mean, money and full-time upstream developers, Red Hat employees working on CentOS. And what they did is basically a copy of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and just remove some of the branding, some of the artwork, and for the most part, not 100%, but for the most part, pretty much the same packages, right? until December 8, 2020, they made a big announcement. In parallel, the same day, the CentOS community and Red Hat, this is just a small piece of their announcement of the blog post, basically saying, we are going to CentOS Stream, right? We're going to focus our efforts on CentOS Stream. And Red Hat, we just notified CentOS the board, and that's it, right? That's okay. I haven't heard any complaints about CentOS Stream. The complaint has been really that the long-term support was reduced by 8 years for the last version of CentOS, major release, to the end of this year. So basically, they gave one year notice, right? That was shocking news. That created lots of controversy, a lot of people angry. I went and read some of the community, some of the post, a lot of good stuff there, or a lot of commentary there, right? But look, why would you do this? And CentOS Stream, as I said, for the most part, I haven't heard really any complaints. It's what is called a rolling release, right? And really, what Red Hat has been doing, kind of behind closed doors from Fedora, and doing the fixes and the testing and all the work before they release. The idea is to do it now do it in the open with CentOS Stream, and then release Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So for the most part, and you can read through the bullet points, for the most part, I mean, it's just the proper way to do it. And by the way, Red Hat took the opportunity also to apply some more DevOps, modernizing some of their, automating some of their processes, and do it better. So now we have CentOS Stream, which is different. It's not CentOS Linux, right? Although they come from the same source. And I found that this chart, this and the next chart, is easy to explain. And I'm just going to go really quick. I know we don't have a lot of time, but for the most part, as you can see, Fedora, keeps going there. This is a place to experiment. You can put Fedora on your laptop, and it's been around for a long time. It's good, but it's not where you put your production environments, right? Red Hat takes downstream from Fedora. It also applies their testing, their validation, the fixes, and then there was just a copy, basically removing the artwork for the most part for CentOS, right? And you can see on the chart, the whole cycle of downloading, updating, you go upstream, your pull request, accept, and so on. What happened now is what Red Hat was doing more of behind the closed doors. Now it's done on the open with CentOS Stream from Fedora, and then they release Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So CentOS Stream a little bit ahead of the commercial version of Red Hat. That's a new CentOS Stream, right? So just a recap on the long-term support. I mentioned December 31st, so at the end of this year. For CentOS 6, already happened, November 2020, so it's end of life right now. They didn't change CentOS 7, by the way, so it stays the same. It was released in 2014. End of life, long-term support is 2024. So I've seen customers already that they are moving back from CentOS 8 to CentOS 7 just for that reason. And because it's easier, the migration as opposed to go and migrate to another distribution. And then CentOS 8, which also a lot of people were not happy because they spent a significant amount of time and money migrating from CentOS 6 and 7 to 8, then just to find out that the long-term support was reduced, right? So that's the current situation there. What are the options? And just really quick, this session is not about Linux, but you can go with CentOS Stream, try to go that way, or a commercial version with Red Hat Enterprise Linux. You can go migrate to some of the forks or copies of CentOS, which there are a few now, actually new ones, right? We always had the Linux, Oracle Linux, which has basically been a copy of CentOS. There's a new one called Rocky Linux. There's a new one, Alma Linux, which actually is here. I don't know if you noticed the Alma Linux, which comes from the company Cloud Linux. So now they have like 2 distributions there. Alma Linux being the open source one. So Rocky Linux, Alma Linux, Navy Linux, and there are going to be more coming, right? So ideally, straightforward migration, although you never know, right? If you're using a different package, might break the application. You have to do your testing. You have to do your planning. Migrate to other Linux distribution altogether, right? A little bit more challenging, but absolutely you can do it. I was just talking to an engineer from our company, from Perforce, and he said, we just tested in Ubuntu. It all just works just fine. Everything perfect. It's like, good, no more work. But you never know if you are using a package. By the way, you know how many packages do we have on any Linux distribution? We have tens of thousands. I mean, we have, one has like more than 10,000. There's I think Ubuntu, which is, they are adding a lot of libraries for AI and machine learning. They have something like 30,000 packages, 30,000, right? So if you're using a package that is not in this distribution, but it's in this distribution, well, your application is going to behave differently or just break, or an API might just break or something, right? So you have to do your planning. And then the fourth option is something that companies like OpenLogic by Perforce, we are offering basically support to extend your long-term support, basically taking care of the patching and professional technical support, just like other companies. So, I mean, I think this slide is extra, right? I think you all agree with this. It's really, really important. I mentioned that the fact that we had long-term support, it basically meant that enterprises kind of adopted the open source, although things are changing with Spark and with Kubernetes and others. But it's very important now, security, right? With this, I guarantee you that next year we're going to have even more sessions about security here, right? We already have a few more. And it's all about, the critical box and the addressing vulnerabilities. And, there's another issue about, reporting, disclosing vulnerabilities. And I know companies like Sonatype are doing a lot of efforts on those things. And that's another topic. But bottom line is you have to keep up with the latest versions, right? And you need to know when there's the end of long-term support, end of life. And of course, if you ignore the end of life, you are at risk and you are at major security risks, right? You're gambling and you don't want to lose your job because of that, right? Yes, it's becoming much more complex if you stay on an end of life version. You say, well, I'm not going to touch it. My application is not going to change. I don't have to do anything. Well, no, guess what? Everything else keeps moving, right? All those dependencies are now different, and even your performance, or even if you have an integration with something else, they're going to say, we don't support that version anymore. So it becomes more and more complex. So I have three examples for you, just because I want to scare you. I want the audience to keep an eye on the end-of-life software, right? I think most people remember this WannaCry, right? And this actually technically is not open source here, the situation, because it was on Windows, right? But the point here, it was on Windows version, a version that it was end of life, that had not received updates, patches in months, right? So they took advantage. WannaCry went and basically installed ransomware and affected more than 200,000 computers all over the world, right? To the point that Microsoft had to do what no one does, which is went back to end-of-life version and patched the end-of-life version and made it available to everyone. That's how big the issue was, right, with WannaCry. And, since then, now ransomware is becoming much popular, but at least people are aware that these things like this happens, and all because of an end-of-life software, right? Another one, do you remember Panama Papers? Well, there's a new one now, right? The Pandora Papers. It just happened 3 weeks ago, maybe. There's a new one, which is much bigger. The point I want to make here, and of course it was leaked, it affected all over the world, and I think only one person got arrested after all that, which is crazy, but it's crazy, but a big deal, right? Big deal. They got in via WordPress end of life and Drupal end of life. That's how they got in. right? Now, maybe you can argue, well, that was a good cause, whatever, but end of life software, that's how they got the data, right? And we don't have any information about Panama Papers yet in terms of how they got that information, or if it was just simple leak, copy and give you the files. Nobody knows, at least not yet, but it's a bigger deal. And then there are news, right? I'm just going to kind of highlight some of these. Magneto, which is for e-commerce, very, very popular. More than 2,000 stores got hacked for an end-of-life version. Cisco, basically they said we're not updating end-of-life version of the VPN. Sonic Wall also with a hack on exploit on an end-of-life firewall. So, very, very important when we talk about security, but most of the vulnerabilities, they have a fix, right? Because people disclose the vulnerability. For the most part, the intelligent way to do it is you disclose a vulnerability when you have the fix, right? So for the most part, all these open source vulnerabilities, they already have a fix, but you have to keep up with the releases. You have to keep up with the versions. So here's an example, and this I was telling you that this is the slide that I added just because I wanted to be part of this. Just a very simple example of one library that has other dependencies, right? So it uses other libraries, and then they use other libraries. So this is a very simple example. This is a very simple example, but a real example, maybe on Node.js or on Python, might look like this, which is hundreds or maybe thousands of many dependencies on those libraries. And those will have vulnerabilities, and there might be some exploits for those vulnerabilities. Now, obviously, there are hundreds, there are thousands of vulnerabilities out there. Some of them are really minor, low score, CVSS score. Some of them might be high or critical. Even in critical, they may not have an exploit, or at least not known exploit yet. But there are others that they do, and you want to take that risk, right? So again, the importance of the long-term support by the communities, by the organizations that are sponsoring or contributing to those communities, and for everyone else to keep an eye on those end-of-life cycles, right? So yeah, every time there's new code, there's a possibility for new vulnerability. Go to GitHub, how many updates, how many commits are there, pull requests out there, they're happening just all the time, right? Things that you pull from NPM or from PyPy, the library, the next time you pull it, it's already updated. It's different. So there's always the risk with new code. As I mentioned, there were different reports, but more or less around 95% of the vulnerabilities already have a fix. You just have to keep up with, right? So the issue is, it's a speed here. You have to keep up with the latest releases. So just to finish the session here, I think it's very important to keep an eye on all these things that I just mentioned. I think open source is great, much better than using closed source, because we don't know what's happening in the closed source environment. But you have to. It's very, very important that support at the release level, and then community level, right? The contributors and people that are fixing and doing the good work there. And then if you need professional support to maintain some of your mission critical or important applications out there, which are based for the most part on open source software. So, very, very important to keep an eye on long-term support, of release support, but then also, who's supporting you, what type of risks you take when you use different open source. Long-term support and end-of-life open source software are really critical factors and for the functionality. So with that, thank you very much.